Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, es ist mir eine große Freude und Ehre, Ihnen den Referenten des heutigen Abendvortrags kurz vorstellen zu dürfen. Edward Harris studierte Classics in Stanford und Oxford und wurde an der Harvard University promoviert. Von 1983 bis 2005 lehrte er am Brooklyn College der City University of New York. 2005 wurde er dann als Professor of Ancient History an die Durham University berufen, wo er bis zu seiner Emeritierung im Jahr 2013 lehrte und forschte. Der Durham University gehört er seither als Emeritus Professor an, zudem ist er Honorary Professor or Fellow an der University of Edinburgh. Hinzu kommen über die Jahre hinweg zahlreiche Fellowships und Gastprofessuren, etwa am Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton oder an der American School of Classical Studies in Athens oder auch als Gastprofessor an der Sorbonne für die Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. In seinen Forschungen hat sich Edward Harris in einem breiten Spektrum mit der Geschichte des antiken Griechenlands befasst und dabei besonders die politischen und rechtlichen Institutionen Athens in klassischer Zeit untersucht. Andere Schwerpunkte seiner Arbeit bilden aber auch die Wirtschaftsgeschichte, ebenso die Rhetorik oder auch geschlechtergeschichtliche Fragen. Es würde viel zu weit gehen, im Einzelnen auf Professor Harris' Publikationen einzugehen. Besondere Erwähnung verdient sicherlich sein 1995 erschienenes Buch Aeschines als Politiker, dann aber auch die unter dem Titel Democracy and the Rule of Law in Classical Athens erschienene Sammlung von Aufsätzen, in denen verschiedenste Aspekte der Geschichte Athens in tiefschürfender Weise analysiert werden. Seine zuletzt erschienene Monographie The Rule of Law in Action Democratic Athens ist nicht hier, beschäftigt sich aus einer New Institutionalism orientierten Perspektive mit dem Rechtssystem Athens und der Rolle des Rechts im Alltag. Zahlreiche weitere Arbeiten wären zu nennen, darunter verdienstvolle Übersetzungen von Reden des Demosthenes in der Reihe The Oratory of Classical Greece sowie zahlreiche Sammelbände. In Vorbereitung befindet sich etwa ein Sammelband zu Berufen in der Antike sowie ein Oxford Handbook of Ancient Greek Law, das wir natürlich gespannt erwarten. Noch mehr gespannt sind wir nun aber natürlich auf Ihre heutigen Ausführungen zu Ancient Demagogues, Modern Populists, Comparisons and Contrasts, and New Institutionalist Approach. Edward Harris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm told this is going to be recorded. And secondly, I'm going to speak without a microphone. Can everybody hear me in the back row? Okay, great. And if I'm not loud enough, I'll shout like Cleon. I would like to begin by thanking Christoph Riedwig, Ricarda Schmidt, and Andreas Walser for organizing this conference on a very timely theme, and for the invitation to give this keynote lecture, which I received a few minutes before 11 p.m. on Monday, the 3rd of February. It may have come at the last minute, but I can never pass up an opportunity to visit Zürich and buy Teuscher chocolates for my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. These were my father's, actually, favorite chocolates, actually. He used to send them to us at Christmas time. I'm also looking forward to our discussions for the next few days, and I would like to thank the University of Zurich and the financial sponsors of this conference, this Schweizerische Akademie der Geistes- und Sozialwissenschaften, Schweizerischen Nationalfonds, SNF, Zürcher Hochschulstiftung, and the Alumni Fund of the University of Zurich. Now, the last time I spoke at the University of Zurich in May 2017, I spoke on a very different topic, the idea of contract in the Greek legal tradition, in a seminar that lasted 4 hours. I hasten to add there were 2 very generous coffee breaks. I promised that my talk tonight will be much more brief and concise, but I must say I discovered that I still have my University of Zurich ID card. So I'm very proud about that. I also promised that I'm not going to talk about any Greek inscriptions tonight. Now, in that seminar, I did not discuss the relevance of the subject for the modern economy, but tonight's talk is very different because the title of the conference itself invites us to think about the relationship between democracy and populism in der griechische Antike und heute, in Greek antiquity and today. Now, normally when I'm asked which lessons ancient history has to teach us, I tend to hesitate. I do this partly out of humility. I've studied the literature and history of ancient Greece ever since my undergraduate years, and have taught these subjects to students for many years in the United States and the United Kingdom, but I'm not an expert in the field of modern politics. I'm also skeptical about attempts to justify the study of the ancient world by stressing their relevance to contemporary life. I spent my professional career teaching and studying the history and literature of the ancient Greeks, because I've always found these subjects intrinsically interesting, because I'm very curious about our common past. I read the epics of Homer, the tragedies of Sophocles, the histories of Herodotus, Xenophon and Thucydides, the speeches of Aeschines and Demosthenes, and the comedy of Aristophanes, because they are great literature and are profound meditations on the human condition. In short, because they are classics in both senses of the word, and also because they contributed to the political traditions that have shaped modern Europe and the United States. When the authors of the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe, enacted on 29 October 2004, wrote that they were drawing inspiration from the cultural, religious, and humanist tradition of Europe, from which have developed the universal values of the inviolable and inalienable human rights of the human person, freedom, democracy, equality, and the rule of law, end of quote. They were building on ideas first formulated by the Greeks, but, as we're going to see, there are very important differences, and the similarities, even though they exist, we should not forget about the differences. Now, I remember once being asked what advice I would give to young men and young women in graduate school starting to teach their first classes to undergraduate students. After some thought, I said that you must always remember that you are teaching great literature and make your student understand and appreciate the qualities of these great works. That does not mean, of course, that one should encourage students to follow all the values expressed in these works. These authors take slavery for granted, they often express disturbing views about non-Greeks, and sometimes give vent to attitudes towards women and sexual violence that most of us in the modern world do not share today. We share with the Greeks a common humanity, and some of their ideas have contributed to our political institutions. But the literature they produced does not provide self-help manuals which can instruct us about how to handle difficult colleagues, raise our children, or manage our household finances. My wife suggested that perhaps we should read Xenophon's Economicus, and I said, I don't think that's a good idea. Well, I may be exaggerating here, but only slightly. Some recent books and essays have advised chief executives of modern corporations to use Alexander the Great as a role model when running their businesses. This is true. If anybody has any questions about this, there's a wonderful book by Frank Holt where he actually kind of reviews this. It's very worrying. If anyone has come to this lecture tonight hoping to hear recommendations about policy or advice about how to vote in the next election, he or she will be very disappointed in what I'm going to say and ought to leave now. Here's the door. My main fear about these attempts to use the classics as guidance for modern politics is that they often do not take into account the differences between the ancient world and the modern world. When I used to teach students at Brooklyn College or at Durham, I would often start by focusing on some keywords that were important for understanding a certain topic. For instance, I started lectures about women in classical Athens by inviting students to think about the practice of marriage and asking them to define the term. And it was very curious, actually, to ask students to define this term marriage because they often couldn't define it. They would say, oh, it has to do with love. But as anyone who's been through a divorce knows, marriage has very little to do with that. At any rate, or I would ask them about the term rape and the modern legal definition of the offense. I would then show them how the ancient concept of marriage, which involved a father or a male relative giving a woman to a husband on certain terms, often involving the payment of dowry, was very different from the modern concept of marriage, which views it as a bond or as a contract between two individuals, not three. In the recent past, the two people have come to be members, used to be members of the opposite sex, but this is no longer the case in several countries. And when discussing the topic of sexual violence, it's important to bear in mind that there is no word in the ancient Greek or Latin which has the same semantic field as the modern term rape. My main objective in these discussions was to encourage students to think away their modern assumptions and to approach the ancients on their own terms. I did not ask them to accept as preferable the way the ancients viewed these issues. I also found that by analyzing the differences between ancient attitudes and modern views, the students could not only better understand why the Greeks acted and spoke the way they did, but also might lead them to reflect on what is distinctive about their own attitudes and social practices. Now, when I use the metro in Athens, which is where I live, I often hear the loudspeaker reminding me, "Prosahisto keno." In English, mind the gap. As historians, we also need to mind the gap when examining the evidence for ancient Greek world. That is why we must be cautious about drawing lessons for the modern world based on hasty and superficial analogies. There may be similarities between ancient politics and modern politics, but there are also significant differences. And I wonder if the differences are not more interesting and instructive than the similarities. But I leave that as a question. Other participants at this conference may disagree, and as a liberal Democrat, I welcome that dissent. I preface my talk with these remarks because, to my knowledge, there's no ancient word that's equivalent to the modern term populism. The Romans had the term popularis, and they contrasted the populares, politicians like the Gracchi, who appealed to the will of the people and proposed popular legislation, with the optimates, who tended to defend the powers of the Senate and the property rights of the wealthy. I would also point out that Athenian democracy had no institution like the Roman Senate, but this is not a conference about Roman history. The Athenians appear to have invented the term demokratia shortly before the year 430 BCE. The term first occurs in literary texts, but does not appear in official documents until around 410 at the very earliest. It's found in a document in Endosthenes on the Mysteries, which some scholars have tried to date to 410 with the aid of two questionable emendations, but the text of this document is now widely regarded as a forgery. Hansen has argued on the basis of the name Demokrates, found in the early 5th century BC, that the term must go back to the reforms of Pleisthenes. But in two excellent studies, which are on the handout, John Giulio and Stephen Lambert, have shown that this name has aristocratic associations and should not be used as evidence for the term. It's also curious the term oligarchia appears for the first time in this period, and the pair of terms appears to have arisen in the context of the ideological struggle between Athens and Sparta in the late 5th century. Before this, the constitutional regimes in Greece were united by their adherence to the rule of law, or eunomia, and opposition to tyranny, two ideals which the Greeks followed in Athens under Solon, and also in Sparta under the great Rhetor. This was the banner under which the Greeks fought the Persians in the wars between 490 and 479. Now, I'd also say, at any rate, I'm not so sure that the democratic reforms of Pleisthenes, even though they're significant, they represent a radical change. But instead, I think there are development of certain ideas and practices already present in the laws and institutions created by Solon. For instance, there's already an assembly under Solon. There are already election of magistrates under Solon. There, even though, again, there is a division into 4 classes. But we should not be misled by the term that the modern term democracy is taken from the ancient term demokratia. Both terms have at their core a view that the people should run the affairs of the community. This is certainly the way Pericles in his funeral oration interprets the term when he says, our politeia is called a demokratia because the management of affairs, the Greek term is oikein, is in the hands of the majority. That is because decisions about major public issues are decided in the assembly by a vote of the majority. And the word is pleonos, actually, in the Greek, which is often mistranslated, but I won't go into that here. But the ways in which ancient communities implemented this ideal and the institutions by which modern states have tried to put democracy into practice are very different. And the ideological justification for modern democracy is also very different. In the Declaration of Independence in the United States, we read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain and unalienable human rights." A few years later, the French Assembly set forth La Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, in which the authors state that all men have certain droits naturels and are inalienables et sacrés. Ancient democracy could not have been based on a concept of inalienable human rights because the practice of slavery was widely practiced and accepted. The Greeks had no objection to allowing masters to exercise the rights of ownership over other human beings. But perhaps we should not stress the differences too much. The Athenians believed that all major decisions about public affairs should be decided by a majority of those who attended the assembly. And the citizens of modern democracies also have the right to elect public officials. And we might add, the citizens of modern democracies sometimes exercise their rights in referendums, in which a majority vote determines public policy, as in the referendum of 2016 in the United Kingdom about membership in the European Union, in which a majority of 46.5 million, 72% of registered voters, decided to leave, a decision which we all know was now finally implemented in 2 weeks ago. Whatever you may think about that decision, it certainly was done in a democratic spirit. There was here in Switzerland, there was a referendum that took place just last Sunday about extending the laws against racism to cover sexual orientation, which I'm happy to see passed by a solid majority. On a local level, there are the Landsgemeinde here in Switzerland, which go back to the later Middle Ages, but have now been abolished in all cantons except Glarus and Appenzell-Innerrhoden. I hope I pronounced those names correctly. Good. And they're perhaps the last remaining vestiges of direct democracy in Europe. There's some excellent articles that were written by Mogens Hansen about the Landsgemeinde about 40 years ago. They're still really very much worth reading. But we should not repeat the mistake and claim that the Athenians had democracy without liberalism. Even though the Greeks did not have a concept of universal human rights, they still had a concept of rights for free persons, and their courts were not arenas for elite competition, but an institution aimed at protecting the substantive rights of individuals, whether they be the rights of liberty, freedom from physical abuse, freedom from slander, the right to property, the right to have one's contracts enforced, and the right to a fair trial according to fixed rules before impartial judges. All the hallmarks of the rule of law. Some members of the elite may have attempted to exploit the courts for political gain, as Cleon did, but one should not confuse the strategies of the players from the rules of the institutions, as Douglas North has reminded us. One should also keep in mind that the Athenians and other Greeks extended access to the courts to medics and foreigners in the same way that modern states allow foreigners access to their courts and extend to them the protection afforded by the police. Without such access, international trade would be impossible. Yes, we should mind the gap between ancient and modern, but we should also not exaggerate the gap as certain people have done. Now, I need to return to populism, sorry. We'll get to the topic. There has been much discussion in the political science literature about the term with several definitions on offer, and several of the previous speakers have actually talked about these different definitions. There seems to be a general consensus, however, that populism is an ideology that sets the people who are portrayed as morally good and honest with an elite who are corrupt and pursue their own self-interest at the expense of the rest of the population. It is this binary opposition which is at the foundation of most varieties of populism. As Muda and Walser observed, quote, populism always involves a critique of the establishment and an adulation of the common people. Close quote. The people also tended to be portrayed as homogeneous, and a populist approach is often seen as conflicting with a more pluralist approach in which decisions are made by bargains and compromises among different groups. The political scientist Ernesto Laclau takes a more optimistic view, and he was similar actually to the view of McCormick, which you talked about. There's a great deal of similarities between those. He takes a more optimistic view. He sees populism as a positive force through which marginalized groups challenge dominant power structures. Among some economists, the term populism has very negative connotations and is associated with high levels of public spending financed by budget deficits and resulting in hyperinflation. The government of Salvador Allende in Chile, where there was an inflation rate of 140% in 1972, and especially Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, where inflation is only 9,000% a year. At any rate, these would be two examples of economic populism. I'm going to come back to this. There is also the nationalistic version of populism, which attacks immigrants and minorities. One thinks of Narendra Modi in India, who has rallied his Hindu supporters against Muslims, or Matteo Salvini in Italy, who opposes asylum seekers from Africa. And of course, there is Donald Trump in the United States, who during his presidential campaign said about Mexican immigrants, and this is a direct quote, "They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they are rapists." End of quote. To avoid looking like a racist, however, he added that some I assume are good people. Later, he sensed that he might have offended some Hispanic voters, who actually could vote in the next election. And he sent a tweet on Cinco de Mayo of 2016, stating that the best taco balls are made in Trump Tower Grill. I love Hispanics. I'm really sorry I don't have a PowerPoint for this, but if you go and troll on the internet, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. To prove his point, he attached a picture of himself eating tacos. Now, yet, of course, the damage was done. These approaches tend to deal in stereotypes and simplify complex problems. We heard that again, the previous speaker talked about the tendency to simplify these complex problems. But some would argue that all politicians simplify issues to some extent, and that this tactic is not confined to populists. To gain power, populists will mobilize their supporters into social movements or political parties. But, and this is important to keep in mind, populism is also a matter of style as well as substance. One social scientist has observed that populists often use colorful and undiplomatic language to distinguish themselves from the governing elite. For example, the populist leader Umberto Bossi would address rallies shouting that the Lega Nord, I can't put this because I'm being recorded, but basically he referred to a certain part of his anatomy which is in the state of arousal. At any rate, you can ask the Italians actually what it was in Italian. In an interview during August 2015, Donald Trump used language implying that Megyn Kelly of Fox News had asked him aggressive questions during a debate because she was menstruating. Quote, "She had blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her whatever," end of quote. This was a breach of decorum, which was rightly condemned both by Republicans and Democrats, but it appears not to have offended his supporters. And I'm not going to quote what Donald Trump was reported as saying in the Access Hollywood tape. You can find that on the internet. This vulgar language is often used by populists to present themselves as one of the people and different from the elite. Clothing can also be used as part of a populist style. In Greece, it was normal for politicians to wear ties in the Vouli and at public events until Alexis Tsipras came along and refused to wear a tie, even when he was offered one by Emmanuel Macron. This was his way of showing solidarity with the common people in his opposition to lobbyists and oligarchs. One can now, if you watch Greek television, you can often tell who's Syriza and who's Nea Demokratia by actually who's wearing ties and who's not wearing ties. So this is the kind of the populist approach to haute couture. I hasten to add that the fact that I'm wearing a tie tonight should not be taken as an endorsement of Nea Demokratia. In some cases, populist speakers urge their supporters to use violence against their opponents. In a very disturbing development, Yogi Adityanath, a Hindu nationalist, called women who were protesting against India's new citizenship law, which discriminates against Muslims, terrorists, and said that they should be fed, quote, bullets, not birani. On the 1st of February 2016, Donald Trump said at a rally in Iowa, quote, "If you see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously, okay? Just knock the hell. I promise you I will pay the legal fees. I promise, I promise." And that's mild in comparison to what Rodrigo Duterte, as the mayor of Davao City, declared in 2009. Quote, "If you are doing an illegal activity in my city, if you are a criminal or part of a syndicate that preys on innocent people in the city, for as long as I am the mayor, you are a legitimate target of assassination." According to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, he has been linked to 1,400 extrajudicial killings. 1,400 extrajudicial killings of alleged criminals and street children by vigilante squads. He is now president of the Philippines. With some modern demagogues, the appeal to the will of the people is often accompanied by a contempt for the rule of law and due process. Now, one might say that the term demagogos was equivalent to the modern word populist. And the modern word demagogue, a person who leads and misleads the people, is certainly taken from the ancient Greek term demagogos. But did the ancient Greek word demagogos always have negative connotations in the way the modern word demagogue does? Let's look at the passages on the handout. Now, actually, some of the previous speakers actually did discuss this, but I've added actually kind of a few more, and I come to the same kind of conclusion. Those of you who are looking these, I'm going to look at several passages in the handout. In the first, the term demagogia simply refers to the leadership of the people and includes those whom the author considers actually good leaders. Those who became leaders of the people later gratified the whims of the many, but that made them bad demagogos, not demagogues. In the next passage, the term is also used generically, even though here the leaders are poor leaders. In the passage from Lysias, we see that demagogoi could be good leaders if they did not take public property. In the passage from Isocrates, advice is given to the king of Cyprus to lead the people well. In the other passage from Isocrates, Pericles is called demagogos and praised for his honest administration. The negative word in this passage is the term sycophantes, a term to which we will return. This is when Cleon is actually attacked. He's attacked more as a sycophantes. Thucydides calls Cleon a demagogos, but that's because he enjoyed popularity. The negative word in this passage is pithanotatos, which implies pernicious influence. This is the word that introduces him at the beginning of the Mytilene debate. In the other passage in Thucydides, Androcles is called demagogos because he too enjoyed popularity. The term implies no moral evaluation. And the term is used in a similar way by the oligarch Critias about the opponents of the 30. And in the passage from Hyperides, the term demagogos appears to be just mean civilian leaders as opposed to generals. And this should come as no surprise. In Athenian democracy, if one wanted to gain power and influence, one had to lead the people whose vote and majority in the assembly determined public policy. And in a recent, very valuable essay, Gianpaolo Orso observes that Polybius tended to use demagogos in the negative sense, but later authors shift back to the neutral sense, especially Appian. In Plutarch, there's an interesting distinction between demagogein, leading the people, and demakopein, which is negative and implies currying favor with the people. In ancient Greek, one could be a good demagogos or a bad demagogos. To translate the term as demagogue is to be seduced by what the French call un faux ami. And in none of these passages do we get the impression that demagogos attempts to set the people against some corrupt elite in the way that modern populists do. Now, another reason why it's difficult to find ancient populists in one way is the structure of Greek political institutions, and here I come to my new institutionalism approach. In work before roughly 1990, political scientists tended to view political institutions simply as a forum for social forces. As March and Olson observed in 1989, from a behavioral point of view, formally organized political institutions have come to be portrayed as arenas within which political behavior is driven by more fundamental factors, occurs, often by, say, social factors. This is the old kind of approach I think we find in Ober's Mass and Elite and David Cohen's Law, Violence, and Community in Classical Athens. March and Olson called for an approach that gives more emphasis to institutional analysis. Quote, without denying both the social context of politics and the motives of individual actors, therefore, institutional analysis posits a more independent role for political institutions. End of quote. They noted that, quote, empirical observations seem to indicate that processes internal to political institutions, although possibly triggered by external events, affect the flow of history. Now, to adopt a more institutional approach to political activity, one needs to place the behaviors of leaders in their institutional context. In the modern world, governments are divided into three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. In the United States, there's a president who holds the executive position and has control of the federal bureaucracy, the Congress with the Senate and House of Representatives, and the courts with the Supreme Court at the top. In the United Kingdom, however, there's the executive and the legislative are combined because the Prime Minister is the leader of the party which commands a majority in Parliament and is not directly elected. And this is a valuable point, I must say. A work that I really admire was Walter Bagehot's work on the English Constitution. Even after 150 years, it still is a very perceptive work. In France, there's a president directly elected by the people. But In all cases, there is a professional bureaucracy under the control of the executive, so subject to the scrutiny of the legislature. The ancient Greeks divided up their political institutions in a very different way, which is reflected in the organization of the chapters 42 and following in the Aristotelian constitution of the Athenians. There was a deliberative part, which was the council and assembly, the officials, who might be elected, this was considered aristocratic, or selected by lot, which was considered democratic, and the courts, whose judges in Athens were selected by lot on any given day. What this system lacked was a professional bureaucracy under the control of the executive. Now, Bohdan has recently claimed that the Athenians were hostile to expertise and were afraid of creating a bureaucracy of technocrats, like the ones in Brussels or Paris. So they acquired a large number of public slaves who filled the functions of a bureaucracy, but remained under the control of the people. According to Ismar, the Gilets jaunes of ancient history in France, this prevented Athenian democracy from falling under the tyranny of technocrats. And this is not the place to analyze all the problems with this book, but let me make 3 points. First, there's no reason to believe that the Athenians were hostile to expertise in law or politics or in finance. Secondly, much of the bureaucratic work was carried out by secretaries who were ordinary citizens. This point was very much well made by Mogens Hansen. And third, the tasks entrusted to public slaves hardly required any expertise, as was observed by Christophe Pébal. Now, modern populists often rage against the bureaucracy, attack its unelected civil servants, and claim that it thwarts the popular will. In an extreme form, populist politicians denounce the deep state. And in fact, in October 2019, White House senior advisor Stephen Miller claimed that the impeachment of Donald Trump was a product of the, quote, deep state, a permanent government of security operatives who run the country and disregard the interests of the people. In France, Marine Le Pen has said, I am the candidate who defends the superiority of politics over administration, the bureaucracy, the economy, and so I think it is politics which must decide. But in Athens, there could be no deep state for populists to attack because there was no professional bureaucracy. Citizens held offices for one year at a time and had to undergo an examination of their accounts at the end of the year. And as Pierre Freulich has shown, his path-breaking Le Contrôle des Magistrats, these procedures were found throughout the Greek polis down to the Hellenistic period. Power was radically decentralized, and there was no political establishment of civil servants for populists to attack. There was also no ancient equivalent of Dominic Cummings, now an unofficial advisor of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, attacking what he calls the blob, which is his name for the BBC, the universities, the quangos, the law courts, and the Whitehall machine, which he refers to by its postal code, SW1, with its Oxbridge humanities graduates. I'm sure, none of your students, I'm sure, Professor Walser. At any rate, which is of course somewhat ironic, because Cummings himself actually studied history at Exeter College, Oxford, where he did actually get a first-class degree. This is also something that was also brought up. All these populists who are constantly talking about the establishment are often products of the establishment themselves. The closest I think we come to this us against them rhetoric is some passages in Demosthenes, especially against Midias. Again, the previous speaker talked about some of these, but actually this is one that really does sound very populist, to this we against them. Perhaps I need to say something about this too right now. In comparison to the wealthy, the rest of us do not share equal rights and access to the laws, men of Athens. We do not share them, no. These men are given the dates to stand trial that they want, and their crimes come before you stale and cold, but if anything happens to the rest of us, each has his case served up fresh. These men have witnesses ready to testify, and well-trained men all available to speak with them and against us. Yes, as you can see in my case, few men are not willing even to give truthful testimony. But again, in this case, we have Demosthenes again portraying himself as a kind of poor victim along with the average person, again, against these wealthy people who are harassing him. We also happen to know that Demosthenes was one of the wealthiest men in Athens at this time. So, there was also no populist political parties in classical Athens or other Greek city-states because there was nothing equivalent to the modern political party. As Mogens Hansen has repeatedly pointed out, there were small political groups around certain leaders in the assembly, but they tended to be very few and often did not last for many years, and they certainly did not enlist a mass following. For instance, Demosthenes and Hyperides cooperated in attacking Philip in the late 340s, but they later fell out. Demosthenes claims that The Athenians organized their politics according to Simiris in one of his Philippics, but this seems to be the only example of this sort of rhetoric. The main reason why there were no political parties is because the structure of Athenian political institutions. There was no need for political parties. If one wanted to win influence, one simply went to one of the meetings of the assembly, which met more than 40 times a year, and spoke directly to one's fellow citizens. One did not need to raise money for advertising or political campaigns. One did not have to be elected to Congress, Parliament, the Assemblée Nationale, or the Bundestag, and to move proposals in classical Athens. At the start of each meeting, the herald asked who wishes to speak, and anyone could answer his call and address items on the agenda. It's true that the agenda was set by the council, but one could ask to address the council even if one was not a member. Now, there also appear not to have been any economic populists in classical Athens, or at least nothing like the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States, or for instance, Peronism in Argentina, even though we'll see there are some similarities. Now, the main reason for this is the different structure of the ancient economy. As I pointed out in 2002, the economy of ancient Athens and most other Greek city-states contained a very high level of horizontal specialization, but very little vertical specialization, a point now widely accepted. This meant that most production was carried out on small farms or in small workshops employing just a few persons. Any larger-scale production, such as in the mines of Lorion, was done by slave labor. As a result, there were no large corporations hiring workers working for a wage, and therefore no conflict between capital and labor, the conflict which led to the rise of unionization in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Because the level of technology was low, there was also little need for large investments to mobilize resources and develop research, or for loans from banks, or raising money by issuing stocks and bonds on financial markets. There were some banks, but they played a very minor role in productive investment, and they certainly no role at all, despite the assertions of one scholar, in maritime finance. This means that the two targets of economic populists of the modern world, capitalists and financiers, did not have enormous power in the ancient Greek world. There were no enormous disparities of wealth, and according to one source, all Athenian citizens except a few thousand owned land, and there were no demands for redistribution, at least in the classical period. There was some hostility toward moneylenders, but aside from a few measures limiting interest, this hostility did not give rise to a social movement or extensive legislation. There were occasional crises involving credit. Victor Walser has written an excellent book on one such crisis in early Hellenistic Ephesus. And there were some demands for the abolition of debt and redistribution of land in the Hellenistic period, but I know that Professor Muller is going to be talking about this tomorrow, so I won't again twist on that. But that would bring me beyond 300 BCE. At Athens, there appears to have been in the 4th century a consensus about property expressed by Demosthenes in a passage from the 4th Philippic. Demosthenes defends the rights of average citizens against the wealthy, but he also defends the rights of the wealthy against the poor. First, he argues that distributions from the Theoric Fund, which had been created probably in the 370s, to the poor, were very important for maintaining social harmony. He compares the money distributed from the Theoric Fund to the state, to citizens, to the support given by children to their parents, on the grounds that the citizens are in effect the parents of the community. And this was not the first fund to make distributions to the poor. As Professor Bloch has pointed out, there was a similar fund called the Diobolia, which existed at the end of the 5th century. And the wealthy were expected to perform liturgies, pay the aesphora, and make generous contributions, which provided some modest redistribution. This prevented the poor from uniting in opposition to the community and actually a need for economic populism. On the other hand, average citizens are told by Demosthenes that they should respect the property rights of the wealthy and not unjustly confiscate their wealth, which would lead to distrust and resentment. So at this point, at least in the 4th century, there seems to have been a kind of consensus about the use of public property and the use of private property. And actually, the protection of private property was actually written into the laws and the oath sworn by the Archon. One does also not find in Athens any Athenian equivalent to the modern hostility towards immigration expressed by certain populist leaders. There are, of course, many negative stereotypes of foreigners in Attic comedy and oratory, and I've given you some of those on the handout. One litigant, Epicrates, in his speech against Athenogenes, denounces his opponent for being a speechwriter and a market type, and the worst of all, an Egyptian. We find a similar denunciation of an Egyptian fish seller in the comic poet Archippus. Another litigant in a Demosthenes speech claims that the merchants of Phaselis borrow money and then try to defraud their creditors. And Aeschines alleges that Timarchus picked up his bad habits living in the Piraeus with merchants and foreigners. And Aristophanes, as we know, also uses ethnic stereotypes. But these attitudes never gave rise to an attempt to limit the number of medics residing in Attica or the number of foreigners visiting the Piraeus and the city of Athens. As the old oligarch rightly notes, and I give you a passage on the sheet, the Athenians needed large numbers of medics because of the number of occupations, that is, the high level of economic specialization, and because of to naptikon. The economy of Athens created high levels of demand, which could not be met just from production by citizens. The Athenians also did not have enough citizens to man their fleet and had to hire foreign rowers for their triremes. There was therefore a strong disincentive against limiting immigration. There was also nothing like the call, for instance, made by David Cameron as Prime Minister to limit immigration to the UK to under 200,000 a year, a policy which was carried out by his Home Secretary Theresa May, which led to a decline of 50% in the number of students coming from India studying in British universities between 2010 and 2015, which was also, of course, had a very negative impact on the balance of payments, actually, in the UK. And she also made it very difficult for other foreign residents, experto predite. The only community which periodically drove out foreigners was Sparta with its Xenoglacia. There were no Athenian politicians demanding that a wall be erected from Aropos to Sunion and from Sunion to Eleusis, or a political party in Athens called Alternativa Attica. Perhaps the leading candidate for the title of populist in democratic Athens would be Cleon. In a book published in 1971, almost 50 years ago, Robert Connor argued that Cleon represented a new politician who was different from earlier politicians in several ways, but mainly because he did not rely on a network of friends and aristocratic connections and appealed directly to the people. But most of his evidence came from anecdotes from Plutarch, and the view that no politicians before Cleon appealed to the people is implausible. Connor also claimed that Cleon came from a new class of men who gained their wealth from industry and challenged traditional ruling class which relied on agriculture. But as Geoffrey Cron has rightly published in his still, unfortunately, unpublished Toronto dissertation, quote, the most common interpretation of the literary evidence in terms of a conflict between landed aristocrats and an emerging commercial middle class is a modern and anachronistic interpretation of ancient attitudes in terms of patterns familiar from medieval and early modern social history, especially the conflict between the upper classes, between the feudal aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, end of quote. Many distinguished families in Attica during the late 5th century were engaged in commercial activities, and Docides could trace his lineage back to the 6th century, yet he also made money in trade. Callias came from an equally respectable family and drew revenues from mining. Alcibiades belonged to an old family, but also relied on slaves working in class. Crone has also pointed out that we should not be taken in by Aristophanes' aspersions on his social background. More reliable evidence shows that he came from a wealthy family and was certainly not a working class hero fighting against the privileged classes. Now, Connor, I think, did not observe the real innovation in Cleon's political tactics, which was the aggressive use of the courts to get rid of enemies. But first, a few words about Ephialtes. The author of the Constitution of the Athenians attributed the change in political culture in 5th century Athens to the so-called reforms of Ephialtes, which put an end to the supremacy of the Areopagus, and several scholars have accepted his account. But the chapters of the Aristotelian Constitution of the Athenians are perhaps the most tendentious and unreliable in the entire work. Recent work has shown that the alleged supremacy of the Areopagus is a myth and contradicted by more reliable evidence. In an excellent article by Matteo Zaccarini, which was recently published in Historia, he's demonstrated that the ancient accounts of Ephialtes are full of contradictions and errors. The most egregious is the statement that Ephialtes cooperated with Themistocles in his attack on the Areopagus in the late 460s. Impossible. We know from other sources that Themistocles was in exile all the time, unless he was using, of course, his cell phone from Egypt, actually, from Asia. Some have claimed that the Areopagus exercised its control over politics through its control of the euthunai of officials, but all the evidence we have for trials shows that they were in the hands of the courts of the assembly. And there are other incredible blunders, such as the statement that Aristides convinced the Athenians to move from the countryside to the city in the 470s. Anyone who has studied field surveys for the 5th century by Hans Lohmann and more recently by Sylvain Fachard for the Mazi Plain know that this is ludicrous. Sylvain told me yesterday, at Mazi, there's a full countryside in the 5th century and the 4th century, and the decline only starts in the 2nd century BCE. Fachard will be your neighbor in the next few years. As you know, he's recently been appointed actually to the chair of Greek archaeology at Lausanne. The account of the period after 462 is all full of errors, such as the statement that the reasonable people lacked a leader because Kimon was too young. But we know Kimon was active in politics before 480 because his name turns up on ostraca. And as Christian Mann has observed in his excellent book, Die Demagogen und das Volk, hinsichtlich der Kommunikation zwischen den Demagogen und dem Volk gibt es keine Indizien, dass die Situation vor 462 eine signifikant andere gewesen wäre als danach. Richtig? Couldn't have said it better myself. To understand Cleon's innovations, we need to review the main sources of political power in the years before the Peloponnesian War. First, there was military leadership. Almost all the politicians between 508 and 430 were generals, and this continued to some extent after 430. Xanthippus, Miltiades, Themistocles, Kimon, Hagnon, Pericles, Nicias, and Alcibiades. The second source of power was wealth, which allowed leading politicians to perform expensive liturgies and to distribute largesse, as we heard in previous talks. A third way to get ahead in Athenian politics was by marriage into prominent families. Kimon married an Alcmaeonid, he married his sister Alcmenike to Callias, and as John Davies noted, very good passage in his book of 1981, from the 450s to the 420s, the families of Pericles, Tysandrus, Callias, Cleinias, Glaucon, and Aldacides conglobulated themselves into a virtual Whig aristocracy, with the marriages of Xanthippus, Glaucon, Leagoras to the daughters of Tysandrus, Pychonicus to Pericles' wife, of Callias to the daughter of Glaucon, and of Alcibiades to Hippolyte. So marriage is also a very important way before Cleon. Finally, politicians before 430 used ostracism to get rid of their enemies and to knock the courts. Themistocles appears to have used ostracism to drive out Aristides, and Themistocles' enemies then ganged up on him to ostracize him later. Kimon's enemies had him ostracized in 462, and as we heard in a previous talk, Pericles also used ostracism to drive out Thucydides, the son of Milesius, in the 440s. Among respectable politicians, also Nicias and Alcibiades continued the tradition by employing it against Hyperbolus. But what changed during the Archidamian War was the use of the courts to attack enemies. Pericles was one of the first victims, but there are several others in the following years. The pattern is very clear. No major politician convicted in the courts between 480 and 430, and yet over a dozen, possibly 24 in the following years. And the man who was primarily responsible for this change was Cleon. In the Knights, Cleon, Aristophanes gives a parody of his tactics, which include constant prosecutions. And actually, if you go through there, just about every type of legal prosecution which you can kind of find in the Athenian origin is actually used by Cleon to attack his enemies. But one cannot understand Cleon's success and that of those who imitated his tactics without examining the institutional framework of the courts and their weaknesses. And here I come back to my new institutionalism approach. I don't think we can look at political styles, whether it be populism or anything else, without looking at the institutions in which they occur. Now, first of all, Cleon and those who followed his tactics were able to exploit the courts because the Athenian courts had nothing like jury selection to eliminate people who would not make an impartial judgment. This was especially problematic for a general after a military defeat, as several generals found out in the late 5th century and 4th centuries. Second, the standard of conviction in Athenian public trial was much lower than in a modern criminal trial, in which one must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In Athenian trials, the accuser convict defendants merely on the basis of probability, and in some cases on their general reputation, as happened in the case of Timarchus, who was talked about by the previous speaker. Third, a modern criminal trial, a prosecutor must get all the jurors to vote for conviction. In an Athenian trial, all that was needed for conviction was a simple majority. Fourth, Athenian trials took place in one day, mainly to prevent bribery, but this led to hasty decisions, as Socrates pointed out at his trial in 399 BCE. Finally, there was no system of appeals to reverse unfair verdicts, and in his laws, Plato saw the problem in some very perceptive paragraphs, and he instituted special courts for such appeals, but there was no provision in the Athenian courts. One must also bear in mind the financial pressures of the Peloponnesian War and the temptation to use the courts to convict the wealthy and confiscate their property in hopes of raising money for the treasury. Now, these tactics help us to understand Cleon's arguments in the debate about Mytilene, which took place in 427 BCE. Now, as we know, after the surrender of the people of Mytilene, who had revolted from Athens, there was a meeting of the assembly to decide what to do. At the first meeting, Cleon proposed that all adult males be put to death, and the women and children sold into slavery. After this meeting, concerns arose that the punishment was too harsh. In a second meeting, the assembly was convened to revisit the decision. As I analyzed in an essay of 2013, Cleon begins by attacking his opponents for not observing the implicit rules of debate in the assembly and for giving an epitaptic speech. He accuses those who introduced the second debate of uttering paradoxes, undermining the stability of the law, showing off their cleverness at the expense of the public good, and acting like sophists and not responsible politicians. Now, Connor thought this attack on sophists was an attack on the upper classes, an attempt to curry favor with the lower classes who do not have education. But the hostility to sophists, actually intellectuals, was shared also by many members of the upper classes. This is just anti-intellectualism. But after charging his opponents with giving the wrong kind of speech, Cleon proceeds to treat them, the debate, as if it were a trial in court, and uses the language of judicial oratory. He calls for the Athenians to respect the law, to impose a penalty on the guilty, and discusses the deterrent effect of punishment at the very end of the speech, in just the way that accusers did in Athenian courts. He justifies this harsh proposal by pointing out the absence of extenuating factors which would have justified epieikeia, fairness. This is another topic which comes from judicial oratory. We don't find the word epieikeia in any other assembly speeches, either in Demosthenes or actually in Thucydides. In his reply, Dionysius rightly observes that a meeting in the assembly is not a trial and argues that Cleon's language and approach are not appropriate in this venue. As we noted before, modern populists often disrupt the norms of political discourse, especially in their use of language, but also by their personal attacks on opponents. I've given you some of President Trump's attacks on personal individuals and the language he used. I'm not going to read through that, but at any rate. But less attention, there's been some analysis of rhetoric in the assembly and courts, but there's been less attention paid to the etiquette of addressing these bodies. From a study of speeches in Thucydides and Xenophon and the speeches of the Anagorators, we can see that there were certain words and certain topics that were normally out of bounds for speakers. For instance, speakers in the assembly do not refer to their own ancestors, but only to the common ancestors of the Athenian people. It was considered also very uncouth to talk about one's liturgies in the assembly. Demosthenes actually criticizes Midias for doing this, but obviously this is one of his attacks on his arrogance and also kind of his lack of respect for discursive norms. The discursive protocols of the courts were slightly different, as we heard in the previous talk. Here too, certain words and phrases were out of bounds. For instance, one could not use vulgar language or refer to parts of the body or use tragic language. When Demosthenes gave a very graphic account of the abuse suffered by an Olynthian woman at a party in Macedonia, it appears that the court erupted in angry indignation and made him stop, if we can believe Aeschines. Now, one of the taboos in the assembly was against accusing one's opponents of deceiving the Athenian people, as recently been shown a very valuable article by Christoph Bramidas. This was acceptable in court, but not in the assembly. Another breach of decorum was attacking the motives and the honesty of speakers. I noticed that there are also rules about this in the British Parliament, which are enforced by the Speaker, as those of you who've been watching John Bercow during the Brexit debates in 2019, there was again, he had a very hard time sometimes restraining members of Parliament from making personal attacks. He himself, of course, was personally attacked because, again, his wife actually was seen driving a car which actually had a Remain sticker on it. Well, anybody who's interested should actually look at the response that he made. But that is actually, again, a very good example of a kind of breach of decorum. In all the speeches founded in Thucydides and Xenophon, speakers never attack the integrity of other speakers, except Cleon in the Mytilene debate, Nicias in the debate about the Sicilian expedition, and Athenagoras in the debate at Syracuse in Book 6 of Thucydides. And with one exception, Demosthenes never names his opponents in speeches delivered to the assembly, and he refrains from accusations of bribery against his opponents until probably after 343. It's interesting to note the reactions in each case in Thucydides. Dionysius rightly notes that such attacks on ethics discourage speakers from speaking their minds and giving the best advice. He also slyly suggests that someone who makes such an attack may himself be receiving bribes. Alcibiades also chides Nicias for his violation of the informal rules of etiquette by trying to divide the young and the old. At Syracuse, after Athenagoras charges Hermocrates with plotting to overthrow the government in an assembly speech, a general intervenes and states, quote, "It is not well for speakers to utter calumnies," the interesting word is diabolos, "against one another, for their hearers to entertain them. We ought rather to look to the intelligence that we have received and how each man by himself and the city as a whole may best prepare to repel the invaders." The general quite perceptibly observes that accusations about personal motive tend to poison the atmosphere and inhibit proper deliberation. This is something we often find in varieties of populist rhetoric. Now, it's customary when ending a talk to present a conclusion or some rousing exhortation. This evening, I would like to finish with two wishes. First, as a liberal Democrat, I strongly believe in the value of dialogue and frank exchange of views. But we cannot have this conversation unless all participants observe certain ground rules of etiquette, and some forms of populism threaten to undermine these ground rules and, again, proper deliberation in a democratic society. And we can never listen to each other if everyone's shouting all the time and flinging about accusations. There is a place for accusations of treason and corruption, but these charges belong to the courts and not to a political forum. And I wish that everyone would be a little more careful about the language he or she uses. Second, there needs to be some basic respect for the evidence when conducting debates. There may be no such thing as absolute truth about a subject, but there are false statements and true statements. During the campaign for the British referendum of 2016 and during the presidential campaign, many writers seem to have lost this humility. In fact, the New York Times has actually now started to make a list of all the false statements by Donald Trump and compared it with the previous presidents. His score is like way up there. Lies have consequences, and especially when it comes to an important topic like climate change. Newspapers now publish fact checks for political speeches, but these appear to have little effect. In both cases, the problem is how to police speech, and especially the speech of a lot of populists. We do not tolerate certain kinds of behavior which threatens the public safety and individual rights, but how to police speech that destroys the conversation that we need to have for proper deliberation. Do we need to have someone for the internet, like the general in the Syracusan assembly in 415? I express these as wishes and thoughts because I frankly have no proposals to make. I would simply hope that all of us never forget our duty as citizens and as scholars to remain both civil with each other and honest about the facts. Those are my two wishes. Thank you very much.
We all thank you for this wonderful, stimulating, and inspiring talk, and I'm sure there are questions from the public. I hope that we can have a discussion that doesn't put me in the role of John Burke who will shout order to the room. Please.
To break the ice, thank you very much for the really wonderful, stimulating paper. And of course, it's always the question of seeing differences and then also continuities. And I did like how after this rush start into the differences. You came around and saw again of many continuities in that. And actually, this is just a minor point which struck my mind when you said that there were no demands of redistribution. But if we look at Aristophanes' picture of Cleon, at least he did sort of not respect the right of individuals in the old time, and he did squeeze them out in order to be able to transfer money a little bit to the people, but mostly into his pocket. And therefore, I mean, there must have been a tendency also for I think, because you mentioned it also, because the situation during the Peloponnesian War was really utterly depressing for the great majority of people who were squeezed into the city, whereas they were so easygoing and happy in the countryside and so on, and therefore they needed to be fed.
No, that's a very good point. And I think I want to combine actually the institutional analysis, but also we need to look at the historical situation. And the rise of Cleon is not just exploiting the courts, but he's exploiting the courts because of a specific situation. You're absolutely right, at the time of the Peloponnesian War. And this leads to a lot of these cases where he is attacking people as a way of getting their money and confiscating it and putting it into the public funds so it can be possibly redistributed or at least kind of help the poor. Yes, those are very good points. Thank you. Yes, Kuba.
Thank you very much, Edward. Just a little point, perhaps with a twist of what you've said. There is actually one point that the modern populists may have learned from Athens, and maybe they still have not. In many countries undergoing this kind of populist constitutional crisis, like Poland, like Hungary, like Israel, there's a claim of the government against the courts, that courts are a-democratic or anti-democratic because of the founding. And obviously, if they looked back to Athens and simplified the story, they could have found a marvelous argument for the cause. The cripple of democracy, let's see how the courts were organized there, let's put them. Of course, in the States, it must be different, but...
No, that is a really good point, and I kind of was thinking about it, and thank you very much for bringing it out. Again, Kuba, like myself, is a legal historian, so at any rate. No, and that's, I think, a difference, because the thing is about Cleon is using democratic courts. These are not professional judges, actually. They are average people. So you have a completely different dynamic there. And as you're absolutely right, I mean, one of the problems nowadays is that populists who get themselves elected to executive positions through a popular vote are then trying to remove the power against them in the courts. And this is not only a problem in Poland, it's also a problem in Hungary, too. And that's a feature of modern populism, which doesn't seem to be a problem of populism in the ancient world. So that's an excellent point. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for your excellent talk. It's excellent. It's directly proportional to the degree to which you're going to be agreeing with me about Trump when I talk tomorrow night.
Oh, good.
But no, actually, I'm wondering if there will be some commonalities. A few differences. I was struck by your noting the general lack of populist attacks on immigrants in Athens, and you framed it in economic terms because the Athenians needed these non-Athenians for so many essential services. It struck me, I mean, that's certainly true, but it struck me that at least in the case of the United States, it's the same. The United States desperately needs the labor of all these immigrants coming over the southern border. So there must be, I mean, there's something else to it. And one's first instinct is about race, because that's a difference. But I don't know. What would you?
No. It's an excellent point, Eric, and thank you very much for that. And it is the only thing is, it's not my idea. It's the old oligarch. I think maybe what we're going to do is take the old oligarch and perhaps send it to the White House. I don't think it's going to make any difference. And no, that's, well, if I may, again, I want to stay away from kind of personal kind of suggestions. But this is, I must say, I was, for instance, I only go back to the United States about once every year. But I was actually going to Nantucket. And the thing was about Nantucket, was that these people were telling us that when I was growing up in the 1950s, there was a local population which was there that used to do a lot of the kind of, the cleaning and cutting the lawns and, run the grocery stores and things like that. The problem is the area got to be so expensive that average people couldn't do this. So you know what they were doing? They were actually getting flights in like May to go over to Bulgaria and actually bring Bulgarians and other people from Eastern Europe all the way over to the United States. There's such a need for labor in the United States. It was interesting because the person who was telling me about this was also ended up being kind of a Trump supporter, and I was thinking, wait a minute, there's a disconnect here. Yeah, it is very odd. I don't want to start discussing Brexit. But at any rate, there is, but I think that the Athenians at least were intelligent enough to see that we have these negative comments and stereotypes. Some in the orators and also in the in the comic poets about certain types of ethnicities, but it never kind of results in kind of any attempt to limit medics. We never hear any proposal that says we got too many medics in the Piraeus here. I think we need to cut down on the numbers. We've got too many foreign merchants coming here. If anything, actually, the Athenians give honorary decrees to foreign merchants to increase trade. So I get I'm perplexed by the modern attitude. I think as I hope you are.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Just to this. Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting and illuminating talk. I'm coming from the history. I'm a historian of the 19th and 20th century, and I was struck by your observation of the absence of attack on the political opponent. And I was wondering, apart from all the very convincing reasons you brought up, whether there was some sort of, whether you could expand on something, or whether there was something like a cultural glue that prevented this, and that might be based on a shared respect for language and rhetoric among those participating in these debates, and whether you could elaborate on that.
No, that's an excellent point. I think the thing is, when we look at political institutions nowadays, we look at, say, the structure of the Bundesrat or the structure of the American government or the structure of, say, of the French Assemblée Nationale, and what are the votes and how often are elections and what are the rules. But there are also a set of informal rules. They're a set of etiquette, as I would call. Now, in the case of the British Parliament, there is the Speaker, basically, who actually enforces certain rules, and some of those are written down. But there are a lot of rules which I think are kind of, informally kind of held. And I think these are all the rules that I was telling you about. I noticed these things, for instance, in assembly speeches. Nobody mentions their liturgies. They just don't do it. In assembly speeches, they also don't mention their ancestors. But there's one person, and Christian knows, who breaks this rule, who is Alcibiades. Alcibiades breaks the rule. And which is very interesting because he is actually called Thucydides actually attacks him for his paranomia. Now this isn't the actual paranomia of breaking it. I think it's his violence actually to these informal norms, which then arouse kind of suspicions about him, certainly in this case. And there are these other kind of informal norms, but the problem is that in times, as Professor Rudwig was telling us, that in the 420s, and we often find this, in times of tension, these kind of informal rules break down. And there is this kind of heightening of the kind of rhetoric, which leads to this kind of very heated language. But unfortunately, it may be very good in expressing certain things, but it inhibits proper deliberation. And we can't have proper deliberation. We can have the best institutions in the world, but if people don't respect certain kind of informal rules, these institutions are not going to work very well. That's why. Does that get around to that? I think there were these informal rules. I mean, I'm a legal historian. I pay attention to those actual rules on the books. But we can't forget these informal rules, which are also very important for the functioning of the system. Is that?
Yeah, that.
Other questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering about the topic of economic inequality, and especially I was wondering about some remarks of Aristotle, if this is the topic I will be treating. So Aristotle seems to frame the question, the pathology, political pathology, we may say, the populism, in economic terms, right? Because he says, the demagogues are presenting themselves as protectors of the aporoi,
right, yes.
Who don't have means.
Yes.
And he also, there's a discussion in him about excluding the banazoi, whatever these are, the people who are hired laborers,
right,
from the citizens.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So this somehow points to some tension, which you may say is some sort of going in the direction of economic inequality. At least Aristotle thinks it is quite important for the stability of the city to balance this gap.
Well, in that sense, I think his remarks are very close then to the remarks of Demosthenes, who basically draws this distinction between attitudes towards the public wealth, public goods, which the average citizen, no matter what their wealth, has basically a right to. And on the other hand, the private realm, where the rights of property need to be respected, provided, of course, you pay your rates for, you contribute to liturgies, and you contribute actually to the trierarchy. And I think the same kind of basis that you're actually talking about in Aristotle, looking forward to listening to what you say. The other problem is I've been speaking mostly about Athens. And obviously the thing is, it's very good about Aristotle is that he looks broadly to other polis, but unfortunately sometimes we only have Aristotle's kind of word for it in cases. And as far as excluding banasoi, I mean, we have the gymnasiarch law from Beroia, which is dated to about 200 BCE, and this actually talks about who's allowed into the gymnasium and who's not allowed in the gymnasium, when the banasoi are actually kind of banned. And actually Aristotle actually would like to kind of have the banasoi kind of banned, but that may be one of these cases where Aristotle is being prescriptive and he's not being descriptive. Good. Other questions? Yes.
Well, I was thinking on a point or answer you gave now. You spoke about this disconnection you felt between this gentleman, in Nantucket and his Trump backing and so on.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, right now, some scholars like Steiner held that we might be coming to a world of oral tradition again. It's something that, okay, we're pretty much stated that we're going to a world where the oral tradition and the writing things would be something of the past, and direct communication would happen. So Mr. Trump has been perhaps the clearest example of this, because Twitter is basically like talking.
Yeah.
And did you find, or have you found, such disconnections between the decisions made by the legislative or police bodies in Athens, as you have, as we can, some of us at least, do observe in America at the moment, or in some other countries?
What kind of disconnection are you talking about?
Let's say, for instance, this one with the migrants, where you are in their need of them, and you say, no, we want to reject them, and do we take that as a public policy because we felt on this populist speech, or maybe as the British example, which I don't know as well as the American one, with the universities, and but we do know from Adam Smith that putting barriers to the movement of people and things don't do good on the long term.
Well, the thing is, it was interesting because I was just writing something about law and economy, and one thing that people constantly talk about is they concentrate so much on the exclusive features of the assembly. But the one thing is the Athenians do is they open their courts to foreigners. They could never have carried on trade. And some people think, oh, this only happens in the middle of the 4th century with the creation of the maritime courts. It's not true at all. The foreigners have access to the courts actually in the 5th century, and that's not the only place. Actually, we know that in a lot of other city-states, in fact, sometimes they have special magistrates who are supposed to look just after after Zenon in order to kind of give them access to the courts, because otherwise there would be kind of no trade. and trade, but this gets into views of the ancient economy. A lot of people used to think, again, Moses Finley, used to think that the ancient economy, the household, and the city-state was trying to be aimed at being self-sufficient. In other words, little bit of trade, and again, and also people not involved in the markets. In the last 10 years, the work of, well, myself, and especially Alan Brachon, showed this is not true at all. There's a great recognition that trade is absolutely important, and therefore you're going to have to open up your, and this is one thing that Pericles actually in the funeral oration says, we open our city to the world. At any rate, you may want to send postcards to the White House. Do that if you want. Other questions? Yeah.
Just for the strangers, I mean, I have been looking very closely now to the night, and there we have 2 or 3 hints at the problem that strangers have less security, for instance, that you could easily make a process against them, and then you could squeeze them out. And in the very last verse, Aristophanes tells the strangers present there, because they have brought their money and so on, they have to pay. See now, you have been so much harmed by this chap here. That means Cleon obviously also did work against them in increasing their contributions.
Yes.
One might think of Trump going to NATO and so on, but still,
no, he actually does actually talk about that. I mean, obviously the medics still have technically the same rights in court. On the other hand, I'm not going to give you a long argument. I think there is actually very good evidence that medics actually did, even though they were accused, they were often acquitted. But obviously, it's not quite. I mean, from a legal point of view, it is a level playing field. Probably, maybe from a rhetorical point of view, it's not completely a level playing field. And you're quite right, actually, to talk about those few examples. Actually, in the nights where Cleon looks like he's picking on medics. There's also a very good passage in Aeschines against Timarchus, where he talks about, starts making threats against medics, which a citizen might not have been worried about, but they basically actually kind of take off because they know they're more vulnerable than citizens. So, yeah.
So you were talking about the institutional differences and the external factors, the external behaviors that don't exist in Greek antiquity and in Athens. And I was wondering about the internal factors, and especially about the emotion that is tapped in many of these modern movements, which is resentment. And the resentment against the elites. And I was wondering if there is any inherent difference, in your opinion, between this well of resentment that makes it possible nowadays to tap into it in a way that maybe was not possible back in Athens. And I was wondering if the sheer mass of people are involved, if the fact that we are talking about a very different number of people plays a role among other possible factors.
The passage that I read from Demosthenes against Midias is obviously an attempt to kind of stir up that sort of resentment by the average person toward the wealthy, which we often find in certain types of populist kind of rhetoric. So there was the potential for it. What's interesting about that is some people have argued that the case actually never went to court, but actually I think now it's moving. I argued 30 years ago it actually did go to court. He does seem to have won, actually. He was using this, but again, as many scholars have pointed out, it's not an original point on my point, is again, and again, this one of the previous speakers said this, it's what's interesting is how this populist rhetoric is often used by some of the wealthy themselves. But they're using it as a way, and the previous speaker did a very good job actually with this, is again, they're trying to get these average people to kind of identify with them actually, as opposed to, and then trying to show that Midias, of course, is a very wealthy person who is separate from them and is different from them. And they are, in very much the same way in this case, actually trying to stir up this kind of jealousy and kind of resentment. So I said that actually would kind of, probably, there is a similarity, but there may be also differences too. Good, I hope I answered your question. Good. Other questions? Thank you for all these. This is very stimulating for me, actually, as a speaker.
Well, thank you very much for the discussion. I think we should close it now. We will have 2 more days to deepen our discussions. I'm sure that many of the points we talked about will come up again tomorrow when we look at different facets of the topic, especially with you to classical actions. We thank you again very much for this very stimulating.